In the grand, sweeping chronicle of the Second World War, certain images have been forged into the very bedrock of our collective memory. They are moments of such visual power and narrative clarity that they transcend history and become legend. No image from the air war is more powerful, more seared into the consciousness of the world, than that of the supermarine Spitfire. Its sleek fuselage and elegant, elliptical wings are the very embodiment of defiance. Its sound, the distinct orchestral roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, is the anthem of a nation's darkest and finest hour. The legend is as simple as it is compelling. In the desperate summer of 1940, as the full might of Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe fell upon Great Britain, a single, perfect fighting machine, flown by a small band of chivalrous heroes, stood alone against the storm and saved the free world. This story, immortalized by the soaring rhetoric of Winston Churchill and reinforced by 1,000 films, books, and memorials, feels true. It is a story of a silver bullet, a miracle weapon, a David against a Goliath. The Spitfire is the perfect protagonist for this epic tale. But this legend, for all its power and for all its emotional truth, is a profound and deeply misleading simplification of history. It is, perhaps, the single most pervasive, most cherished, and, to the serious historian, the most hated aviation myth of the entire global conflict. The truth is not that the Spitfire was unimportant, it was a magnificent feat of aeronautical engineering, a purebred killer. The truth is that the real story of the Battle of Britain, and the Spitfire's role within it, is infinitely more complex, more collaborative, and ultimately, more awe-inspiring than the simple myth allows. Over the course of this investigation, we will act as historical adjudicators. We will deploy the primary evidence, the production figures, the squadron logbooks, the after-action reports, and the strategic analyses from both sides, to dismantle three of the most deeply entrenched and consequential myths of the Second World War in the air. We will reveal the hidden truths behind the machines we think we know, the doctrines that sent thousands of men to their deaths based on flawed assumptions, and the secret weapons that changed the course of the war in complete silence. We will begin here, in the skies over southern England in 1940, to expose a more complicated reality. To understand that the battle was won not by one machine, but by two. That the victory was secured not just by the courage of the few, but by the tireless, unseen labor of thousands of ordinary people, many of them women, staring at cathode ray tubes and moving wooden blocks across giant maps. We will demonstrate that the Luftwaffe was defeated not by a single silver sword, but by a brilliant, invisible, and revolutionary system of war that the enemy never truly understood. The myths are comforting. The truth is a weapon. And it is time to deploy it. The Hawker Hurricane was, by every measure, the forgotten warrior of the Battle of Britain. It was the Spitfire's older, less glamorous, and far more numerous stablemate. Where the Spitfire was a graceful thoroughbred, a product of advanced, stressed-skin aluminum construction, the Hurricane was a rugged workhorse, an evolutionary bridge between the old world of fabric-covered biplanes and the new era of the monoplane fighter. Its fuselage was a complex structure of steel tubing covered with fabric, a design that seemed almost archaic compared to the sleek monocoque of its more famous partner. It was slower, it could not climb as fast, and above 20,000 feet, its performance began to lag significantly behind both the Spitfire and the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. To the casual observer, and indeed to the myth-makers of history, it was an inferior machine, a supporting actor in a drama that belonged to the Spitfire. Yet, to ignore the Hurricane is to fundamentally misunderstand how the Battle of Britain was actually fought and won. The raw, indisputable numbers tell a story that the legend conveniently omits. On July 10, 1940, the day the battle is considered to have begun, RAF Fighter Command had on strength approximately 32 squadrons of Hurricanes, compared to just 19 squadrons of Spitfires. Throughout the entire period of the battle, from July to October, Hurricanes consistently outnumbered Spitfires in the frontline squadrons by a ratio of nearly 2-to-1. This numerical supremacy was no accident, it was a consequence of a brutal, pragmatic reality. The Hurricane, with its simpler construction, was significantly easier and faster to manufacture. In the desperate race to build up Britain's defenses after the fall of France, this was a decisive advantage. More critically, the Hurricane proved to be an astonishingly resilient machine. The same fabric-over-frame construction that made it seem obsolete also made it a maintenance chief's dream. Unlike the Spitfire, where a cannon shell could tear through the stressed skin wing and require complex factory-level repairs, cannon shells often passed straight through the Hurricane's fabric covering, causing damage that could be patched up at the airfield level in a matter of hours. This meant a damaged Hurricane could be returned to the fight far more quickly than a damaged Spitfire. In a battle of attrition, where every available airframe was a precious resource, this ruggedness, this ability to absorb punishment and get back into the sky, was arguably more important than outright performance. While Spitfires were being painstakingly repaired, Hurricanes were being patched up and sent back into the fray, again and again. The most crucial fact, however, lies buried in the official records. During the Battle of Britain, it was the Hawker Hurricane that was responsible for shooting down more enemy aircraft than all other defenses, air and ground, combined. Hurricane pilots were credited with destroying more German bombers, more Messerschmitt Bf-109s, and more Messerschmitt Bf-110s than the pilots of the Spitfire. The numbers are not even close. The Hurricane was the true workhorse executioner of the battle. While the legend casts the Spitfire as the elegant duelist, the reality on the ground was that the Hawker Hurricane was the blunt, bloody instrument of Britain's salvation. The tactical deployment of Britain's two premier fighters was not a matter of chance. It was a brilliantly pragmatic and deeply calculated strategy, orchestrated by the quiet genius who led RAF Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Dowding and his key subordinate, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded the critical No. 11 group covering southeast England, were not romantics. They were unsentimental practitioners of a new kind of industrial warfare. They understood with absolute clarity the strengths and weaknesses of their machines, and they refused to be seduced by the allure of the Spitfire's superior performance. Their entire defensive plan was built on a cold, hard, and brutally effective division of labor, a strategy that the German High Command never fully comprehended. The core of this strategy was simple. The Hurricanes would tackle the bombers, and the Spitfires would take on the fighters. This was not a rigid, unbreakable rule, but it was the fundamental tactical principle that governed the battle. Dowding and Park knew that the Spitfire, with its superior speed, rate of climb, and high-altitude performance, was the only aircraft they possessed that was a true match for the formidable Messerschmitt Bf-109. The Bf-109s were the bombers' guardians, the high-flying predators tasked with clearing the skies for the lumbering formations of Heinkels and Dorniers. Therefore, the Spitfire squadrons were assigned the most difficult and arguably the most vital task: to intercept the German fighter screens, to engage them on their own terms, and to tie them up in swirling high-altitude dogfights. The goal of the Spitfire was not necessarily to rack up a high score of its own, but to prevent the German fighters from doing their job. They were the shield, the high-altitude cavalry charge sent to disrupt and neutralize the enemy's most dangerous weapon. This freed up the more numerous, more rugged, but slower Hurricanes to perform their primary and most decisive function, to destroy the bombers. Flying at a slightly lower altitude, the Hurricane squadrons would wait for the Spitfires to engage the escort, and then they would plow headlong into the German bomber streams. Here, the Hurricane's perceived weaknesses became strengths. It was an incredibly stable gun platform, its 8 Browning .303 machine guns arranged in the wings capable of delivering a devastating weight of fire. And against the relatively slow and unmaneuverable German bombers, its slight performance deficit to the Bf-109 was almost entirely irrelevant. The Hurricane was the perfect bomber killer: tough, well-armed, and most importantly, available in vast numbers. While the Spitfires were engaged in the deadly, high-stakes duels with their German counterparts, the Hurricanes were methodically, brutally, and systematically dismantling the very force that had been sent to destroy the RAF on the ground and break the will of the British people. The Germans saw Spitfires and Hurricanes as interchangeable fighters. Dowding and Park saw them as two different tools for two different jobs, and in that intellectual distinction lay the seed of victory. The second great aviation myth of the Second World War is a uniquely American article of faith. It is a doctrine born from the visionary, almost messianic, pronouncements of men like Julio Douhet and Billy Mitchell, who preached that a new and terrible god of war had arrived: the heavy bomber. This doctrine held that a fleet of high-flying, heavily armed bombers could fly unescorted into the heart of an enemy nation, absorb any losses, and through precision daylight bombing of key industrial targets, shatter that nation's ability to wage war. It was a seductive, technologically advanced theory that promised a swift, clean, and decisive victory, won not by the bloody attrition of trench warfare, but by the clean, industrial application of air power. By 1943, this theory had become the central, unshakable dogma of the United States Army Air Forces. The physical embodiment of this faith was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, a four-engine silver behemoth bristling with up to 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, earning it the name Flying Fortress. The core of the American myth was that these bombers, flying in tightly packed, combat box formations, could create a self-defending, interlocking field of fire so dense and so deadly that no enemy fighter could possibly penetrate it. The theory was that the bombers could protect themselves. They believed, with an almost religious conviction, that fighter escort, while helpful, was not strictly necessary. This belief was not just a casual assumption. It was the foundational principle upon which the entire American strategic bombing campaign was built, an article of faith for which thousands of young men would be asked to die. The German Luftwaffe, however, was not impressed by this theory. Their own doctrine was brutally pragmatic, forged in the real-world combat of the Spanish Civil War and the skies over Poland and France. Their commanders, men like Werner Mulders and Adolf Galland, were fighter pilots first. Their entire defensive strategy was predicated on a simple, observable fact: a bomber is a bomber, and a fighter is a fighter. They did not believe in the concept of a self-defending bomber. Their experience taught them that any bomber, no matter how well armed, was ultimately a slow, lumbering target when confronted by a determined, high-speed fighter aircraft. The German High Command viewed the American belief in the unescorted bomber not as a credible threat, but as a sign of profound tactical naivety. This created a vast intellectual chasm between the two opposing air forces. On one side, an American command structure dogmatically attached to a pre-war theory of air power. On the other, a German command structure whose entire existence was based on the practical application of fighter-based air superiority. The skies over the German Reich in 1943 would become the brutal, unforgiving laboratory where these two competing doctrines would be tested. The Americans were supremely confident in their theory and their machine. The Germans were equally confident that this theory was a suicidal fantasy. One of them was catastrophically wrong, and the proof would be written in the contrails of smoke and fire that would soon stretch from the North Sea coast to the very heart of the Third Reich. The first cracks in the American doctrine began to appear in the summer of 1943, with a series of costly, deep penetration raids that pushed the unescorted bomber streams to their breaking point. But it was the autumn that would see the theory of the self-defending bomber not just cracked, but utterly and irredeemably shattered. The crucible was a pair of missions so brutal, so devastating in their losses, that their names are spoken with a kind of hushed reverence in the annals of the 8th Air Force: Schweinfurt and Regensburg. In August, and then again in October, the USAF dispatched massive fleets of B-17s to strike at these two cities, home to the nerve centers of the German aircraft and ball-bearing industries. These were not mere raids, they were the ultimate test of the unescorted bombing campaign, a steel gauntlet thrown down into the very heartland of the enemy's air defense. The German response was not the chaotic swarm of individual dogfights the Americans had perhaps envisioned. It was a cold, methodical, and brilliantly orchestrated symphony of destruction. The German general of the fighters, Adolf Galland, had meticulously organized the defense of the Reich into a layered, multi-stage system designed specifically to dismantle the American combat box formations. As the bombers crossed into German airspace and their short-range P-47 Thunderbolt escorts were forced to turn back, the slaughter began. German ground controllers, using a sophisticated network of Freya and Würzburg radar stations, guided their fighter wings, or Jägerschwader, with chilling precision. The Luftwaffe pilots had analyzed the B-17's defensive weaknesses with a clinical eye. They knew the bombers were most vulnerable to attack from the front, where their defensive firepower was weakest. They developed terrifying head-on attack runs, or Sternangriff, where entire squadrons of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s would fly straight at the bombers, nose to nose, their cannons blazing. This required incredible nerve, but it was devastatingly effective, allowing the German pilots to bypass the densest fields of fire from the bombers' waist and tail gunners. Furthermore, they armed their twin-engine Zerstörer, the destroyer fighters like the Bf-110, with heavy cannons and even primitive air-to-air rockets, allowing them to stand off from a distance and lob explosives into the tightly packed bomber formations, breaking them apart for the single-engine fighters to finish off. The results of these missions were catastrophic and undeniable. On the second raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s, with another 140 suffering significant battle damage. 600 American airmen were lost in a single afternoon. The losses were not just unsustainable, they were apocalyptic. They were proof, written in fire and blood across the German sky, that the core assumption of the American bombing campaign was a catastrophic failure. The B-17 was a fortress, but it was not impregnable. The combat box was a formidable defensive formation, but it was not impenetrable. The myth of the self-defending bomber was dead, buried in the smoking, wreckage-strewn fields around a small German city that produced ball bearings. The confidence of the American planners was shattered, and the entire daylight bombing campaign was brought to a screeching halt, teetering on the very edge of outright defeat. The catastrophic failure of the unescorted bomber doctrine plunged the leadership of the United States Army Air Forces into a profound crisis. The silence from the American High Command in the weeks following Black Thursday was deafening. It was a tacit admission that the Luftwaffe had been right, and that their own core philosophy of air power was fundamentally broken. The daylight bombing campaign, which had been championed as the key to unlocking a swift victory, was suspended. The very future of the strategic air war over Germany hung in the balance. The brutal truth was that a machine, no matter how powerful, is only as effective as the doctrine that deploys it. The B-17 was a brilliant aircraft, but it had been sent to war with a flawed, arrogant, and ultimately suicidal set of instructions. The psychological impact on the bomber crews who survived these missions was just as devastating as the physical losses. These were men who had been told, and who had believed, that their formidable flying fortresses could fight their way to any target and back. That faith was now shattered, replaced by a cold, grim understanding of their own vulnerability. The long journey into the heart of the Reich was no longer a bold crusade, it was a death march. For the Luftwaffe pilots, the effect was the polar opposite. Their confidence, already high, soared to a level of near invincibility. They had met the enemy's best weapon and best tactic head-on and had utterly crushed it. They had proven their own doctrine of fighter supremacy to be correct in the most brutal and decisive way imaginable. The solution, when it finally came, represented a complete and humiliating reversal of the very doctrine that had led to the disaster. It was a forced admission that the Germans had been right all along. The answer was not a bigger bomber, or more guns, or a new formation. The answer was the one thing the original doctrine had dismissed as unnecessary, a long-range escort fighter. The salvation of the heavy bomber, and the entire strategic air campaign, would come in the form of the North American P-51 Mustang. The arrival of the Mustang in the skies over Europe in early 1944 did not just provide a shield for the bombers, it fundamentally rewrote the rules of the air war. It was a weapon that allowed the Allies to finally deploy a doctrine that worked. To take the fighter war to the enemy, to hunt the Luftwaffe in its own skies, and to clear a path for the bombers to strike their targets. This pivot, born of desperation and defeat, was one of the most significant strategic shifts of the entire war. The myth of the self-defending bomber was replaced by the reality of fighter-led air supremacy. The story of the air war is therefore not just a story of the B-17, but a story of how a flawed doctrine almost led to catastrophic failure, and how the acceptance of that failure, and the adoption of a new weapon system in the P-51, ultimately led to total victory. The original myth celebrated the bomber as an independent, war-winning weapon. The truth is that the bomber was a vulnerable giant that could only succeed when the myth of its own invincibility was finally abandoned. The third and perhaps most insidious aviation myth of the Second World War concerns the Imperial Japanese pilot. In the Western imagination, Particularly in the desperate early years of the Pacific War, the Japanese aviator was transformed into a near-supernatural figure. He was portrayed as a uniquely gifted warrior, a man possessed of a mysterious, innate flying ability that no Westerner could hope to match. He was a product of a warrior culture, the modern incarnation of the samurai, unburdened by fear of death and capable of pushing his aircraft to its absolute limits and beyond. This myth suggested that the Japanese held an almost racial or cultural advantage in the air, a natural superiority that made them invincible in a one-on-one dogfight. This narrative was born from a very real and terrifying historical moment. In the 6 months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, flying the Mitsubishi A6M0, cut a swath of destruction across the Pacific that was breathtaking in its speed and totality. Allied pilots, flying aircraft like the Brewster Buffalo and the early P-40 Warhawks, were utterly outclassed. The Zero was a marvel of aeronautical engineering, a lightweight, exquisitely agile fighter that could outclimb and, most critically, outturn anything the Allies could put in the sky. When this superior machine was combined with the fact that the pre-war Japanese naval pilots were arguably the most rigorously trained and experienced aviators in the world, the result was a period of shocking, one-sided slaughter. This lopsided reality, filtered through the panic of defeat and a profound lack of understanding of the enemy, created the myth. Allied pilots returning from missions would speak in awe of the Zero's seemingly impossible maneuverability and the almost suicidal aggression of its pilots. They were facing an enemy who fought by a different set of rules, an enemy who seemed to possess a sixth sense for aerial combat. The Japanese High Command, for their part, did everything to cultivate this myth. It was a powerful tool of psychological warfare, both for demoralizing their enemies and for reinforcing a sense of martial supremacy at home. They, too, began to believe in the innate superiority of the Japanese warrior spirit, or Yamato Damashii, as a tangible weapon of war. But this myth of the Superman pilot, while born from a period of genuine Japanese dominance, was a dangerous and ultimately fatal delusion. It confused a temporary technological and experiential advantage with a permanent, innate superiority. It created a strategic blind spot, a sense of arrogant confidence that would prevent the Japanese military from seeing the catastrophic structural weaknesses in their own pilot training and replacement system. While the West saw an army of invincible samurai, the reality was that Japan had entered the war with a small, exquisitely trained, but ultimately irreplaceable cadre of elite aviators. And the myth of their invincibility would crumble the moment the Allies began to produce machines and develop tactics that could challenge them on equal terms, exposing the fragile, hollow foundation upon which Japan's entire air strategy was built. The machine at the heart of the Japanese myth was the Mitsubishi A6M, universally known as the Zero. To understand the myth, one must first understand the genius and the profound, fatal flaws of this legendary aircraft. Designed to meet a nearly impossible set of specifications from the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Zero was a masterpiece of lightweight design. Its chief engineer, Jiro Horikoshi, was tasked with creating a carrier-based fighter that possessed unprecedented range, a blistering rate of climb, and, above all, supreme maneuverability. To achieve this, Horikoshi and his team made a series of revolutionary and ultimately catastrophic design choices. They built the aircraft from a new, top-secret aluminum alloy, and they ruthlessly eliminated every single ounce of unnecessary weight. The result was an aircraft that, in 1941, was arguably the finest carrier fighter in the world. It had an astonishing operational range of over 1,600 miles, allowing it to project Japanese air power far beyond what any Allied planner thought possible. And in a slow-speed, turning dogfight, it was utterly supreme. It could fly circles around the heavier, more robust Allied fighters of the period. This incredible agility was the source of its legendary status. Allied pilots who attempted to engage the Zero in a traditional turning fight were committing suicide. The Zero would invariably slip onto their tail and tear them apart with its 220mm cannons. This was the technological reality that gave birth to the myth of the Superman pilot. The Japanese pilots weren't supernatural. They were simply flying a machine that was purpose-built to excel in the exact type of combat that every fighter pilot in the world had been trained to engage in. However, the Zero's breathtaking performance came at a terrible, hidden cost. In the obsessive quest to save weight, Horikoshi had stripped the aircraft of two things that American and European designers were beginning to consider essential: armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. The pilot sat in a completely unprotected cockpit, with no steel plate behind him to protect him from rear attack. The fuel tanks, located in the fragile wings, were simply aluminum boxes filled with high-octane gasoline. The Zero was, in effect, a magnificently engineered flying tinderbox. It was a duelist's rapier, an exquisite offensive weapon with almost no defensive capability whatsoever. A short burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire from an American fighter, even a glancing hit, was often enough to set a Zero's fuel tank ablaze, turning the world's most agile fighter into a plume of black smoke and a funeral pyre for its pilot. This was the fatal trade-off at the heart of Japanese air power. Their entire doctrine was built around the elegant, offensive ballet of the dogfight. They prioritized agility above all else, creating a machine that could win any turning contest, but could not survive a single mistake. The Allies, by contrast, were building their fighters like the American Grumman F-4F Wildcat and the later F-6F Hellcat, on a completely different philosophy. These aircraft were heavy, rugged, and well-armored. They were designed not to outturn the enemy, but to absorb punishment, to survive, and to bring their pilot home. When the myth of the Japanese Superman pilot collided with the brutal, industrial reality of an American fighter that could take a punch and hit back twice as hard, the myth began to burn. The unraveling of the Japanese myth began not with a new superweapon, but with a new way of thinking. The American pilots in the Pacific, particularly those of the United States Navy, were pragmatic, clear-eyed realists. They knew they could not outturn the Zero, so they stopped trying. Led by brilliant tactical innovators like Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, they developed revolutionary new tactics that were designed to neutralize the Zero's agility and exploit its catastrophic defensive weaknesses. The most famous of these was the Thatch Weave, a deceptively simple, two-plane maneuver where two American fighters, when attacked, would turn towards each other, crisscrossing paths. This simple act of teamwork presented a chasing Japanese pilot with an impossible dilemma. If he continued to pursue the first aircraft, he would expose his tail to a head-on gunnery run from the second. The Japanese pilots, whose entire training and doctrine was based on the glory of the one-on-one samurai duel, were utterly baffled by this tactic. They were being defeated not by superior flying, but by superior geometry. At the same time, a new generation of American aircraft began to arrive in the Pacific, most notably the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was the physical embodiment of the American industrial philosophy of war. It was not as agile as the Zero. It was a big, heavy, brutish fighter, built around one of the most powerful engines of the war, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. What the Hellcat possessed was overwhelming horsepower. This allowed American pilots to perfect a new tactical doctrine that would become the bane of the Japanese Air Force: boom and zoom. An American pilot would use his superior engine power to achieve a higher altitude than his opponent, and then dive on the Zero from above, making a single, high-speed firing pass, the boom, and then using his momentum and engine power to climb vertically away, back into the safety of high altitude, the zoom. This was a tactic the Zero pilot simply could not counter. If he tried to follow the Hellcat in a climb, his lightweight airframe and less powerful engine would cause him to stall, leaving him a sitting duck. The boom and zoom refused to play the Zero's game. It was the industrial, methodical application of overwhelming force, a refusal to engage in the elegant, turning dogfight that the Japanese so prized. The result of these new tactics and this new technology was a slaughter. At battles like the Philippine Sea in 1944, in what American pilots would come to call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the myth of the Japanese ace pilot was laid to rest forever. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were shot from the sky, most of them flown by young, inexperienced recruits who were the product of a broken training system. This exposes the ultimate fallacy of the myth. Japan had entered the war with a small number of superb pilots, but it had no system for replacing its losses. Their training pipeline was long, arduous, and produced only a trickle of new aviators. When their veteran aces were killed in their fragile, unarmored Zeros during the great carrier battles of 1942 and 1943, there was no one of equal caliber to take their place. The United States, by contrast, had a massive, industrial-scale training system that was producing tens of thousands of well-trained, competent pilots. The myth of the Japanese Superman was not just a myth, it was a strategic catastrophe. It had blinded the Japanese high command to their own fatal weakness. They had mistaken a temporary advantage in experience for an innate, cultural superiority, and in doing so, they had sent an entire generation of their best and brightest to die in a war they could never hope to win. From the desperate defense of the British Isles, to the vast, fire-scorched skies of the German Reich, to the seemingly endless blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a clear and undeniable pattern begins to emerge. In dissecting these three foundational myths of the air war, we uncover a deeper, more profound truth about the nature of modern, industrial conflict. The legends that nations tell themselves in wartime are almost always stories of singular genius, of miracle weapons, and of the innate, almost spiritual superiority of their own warriors. The truth of the Second World War, however, is a far more complex and far less romantic story. It is a story not of silver bullets, but of systems, not of supermen, but of training pipelines and replacement depots. The myth of the Spitfire's solitary victory is perhaps the most noble of the legends. But its danger lies in the fact that it erases the crucial contributions of the less glamorous but more numerous Hawker Hurricane. More importantly, it completely ignores the revolutionary, war-winning, integrated defense system conceived by Hugh Dowding, a system that relied as much on the quiet, meticulous work of female radar operators and plotters as it did on the dashing courage of the fighter pilot. The victory was not won by a single sword, but by a vast, invisible web of technology and human coordination. The German Luftwaffe was not defeated by a better airplane. It was defeated by a superior doctrine of command and control. Likewise, the myth of the self-defending flying fortress is a cautionary tale about the mortal danger of believing one's own propaganda. It was a doctrine born in peacetime, a theoretical dream of a clean, decisive victory that shattered itself against the brutal, pragmatic reality of German air defense. The American airmen who were sacrificed on the altar of this myth were not let down by their machine, they were let down by a flawed philosophy, an arrogant refusal to accept the fundamental truth that the fighter is the true master of the sky. The eventual victory of the strategic bombing campaign was only secured when this arrogant myth was abandoned and the supremacy of the long-range escort fighter, the P-51 Mustang, was finally and fully embraced. Finally, the myth of the supernatural Japanese ace, the invincible samurai of the sky, reveals the fatal flaw in confusing a temporary advantage with an inherent superiority. The Japanese entered the war with a superb aircraft in the Zero, and arguably the best-trained pilots in the world. But their entire military culture, built on a belief in the spiritual power of the individual warrior, blinded them to the brutal, industrial mathematics of a war of attrition. They had no system for replacing their losses. They had no appreciation for defensive technology like armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. They were masters of the duel in a war that was ultimately decided by the factory floor, the training school, and the tactical briefing room. They were defeated not by a braver warrior, but by a more resilient, adaptable, and intellectually flexible system of war. The thread that connects all these debunked myths is the same. In the Second World War, victory in the air was ultimately achieved not by the better machine or the better man, but by the better system. In the final analysis, our journey through the most pervasive myths of the Second World War in the air reveals a powerful and sometimes uncomfortable truth. Our collective memory of war is not always a reflection of history as it happened, but of the story we need to believe. We crave the simplicity of a single hero, the elegance of a miracle weapon, and the reassurance of a divinely gifted warrior. These stories are not necessarily born from a deliberate desire to deceive, but from a deeply human need to find clarity and meaning in the chaotic, industrial slaughter of modern conflict. They are tools of morale, instruments of national identity, and convenient shorthands for immensely complex historical events. The legend of the Spitfire provided a symbol of defiance and technological grace at a time when Britain stood alone, a beautiful and potent narrative that helped to steel the resolve of a nation under siege. The story of the Invincible Flying Fortress was a projection of American industrial might and technological confidence, A belief that the complex problems of a global war could be solved through engineering and sheer audacity. And the myth of the Japanese Superman pilot was a way for the Allies to rationalize their shocking early defeats, creating a larger-than-life foe whose downfall would be all the more glorious. These myths served a purpose. They were essential components of the psychological war that runs parallel to the physical one. The danger, however, arises when these wartime narratives are allowed to settle and harden into accepted historical fact. When this happens, the myths do a profound disservice to the very history they claim to represent. They erase nuance, they obscure vital contributions, and they distort the crucial lessons that can only be learned from an unflinching examination of the truth. Glorifying the Spitfire alone robs the Hawker Hurricane of its rightful place as the workhorse of victory and diminishes the intellectual achievement of the Dowding system. Perpetuating the myth of the self-defending bomber papers over a catastrophic doctrinal failure that cost thousands of lives and dishonors the memory of the men who were sacrificed to prove it wrong. And clinging to the idea of the Japanese Superman pilot prevents a true understanding of the systemic failures of doctrine and logistics that led to the collapse of the Japanese Empire. Therefore, the role of the historian, and the mission of this channel, is to act as a corrective lens. It is our duty to look past the powerful, seductive simplicity of the myth and to embrace the messy, complicated, and often far more interesting reality. We do not do this to tear down heroes or to diminish great achievements. We do it to build a richer, more complete, and more accurate understanding of the past. The men who flew the hurricane, the women who plotted the raids, the tacticians who rewrote the rulebook, and the factory workers who built the resilient Hellcats are all vital parts of the story. To let their contributions be overshadowed by a more convenient legend is to fail them, and to fail our duty to history itself. Why, then, do we call these the most hated aviation myths? It is not because they are trivial errors, like mistaking the caliber of a machine gun or the top speed of an aircraft. It is because these three myths, in particular, are not merely inaccurate, they are fundamentally corrupting. They actively conceal the true nature of victory and defeat in the Second World War. They replace the complex, brutal calculus of systems, logistics, and industrial production with a romanticized, almost medieval fantasy of individual champions and magic swords. To accept these myths is to willfully misunderstand the foundational truths of the largest conflict in human history. The truth of the air war is that victory was not a matter of spirit or of a single brilliant machine, but of systems. The Battle of Britain was won by an integrated defense system that outthought the enemy. The war over the Reich was won by a strategic system that finally and painfully accepted the necessity of fighter escort. The war in the Pacific was won by a logistical and training system that could absorb horrific losses and replace them, while the enemy's system, built on a fragile cult of the irreplaceable warrior, could not. To ignore these systemic realities is to learn nothing. These myths are hated because they are a disservice to the memory of the men and women who actually fought and won the war. The ground crew chief who worked for 48 hours straight in the mud to patch the fabric on a hurricane's wing is a hero of the Battle of Britain. The WAAF plotter who calmly tracked a raid of 100 bombers while the world shook around her is a hero of the Battle of Britain. Their contributions are real, tangible, and war-winning, but they are erased by the beautiful, simple lie of the lone Spitfire. The American theorist who finally had the courage to admit the unescorted doctrine was a failure, and in doing so saved the lives of thousands of bomber crewmen, is a hero of the air war. His story is obscured by the myth of the invincible fortress. Ultimately, the purpose of studying history is not to collect comforting fables, but to understand cause and effect. It is to learn how wars are truly won and lost. The lessons of the Second World War are not about the beauty of a wing's shape or the innate superiority of one nation's pilots. They are about the brutal importance of logistics, the life-or-death necessity of adaptable doctrine, the critical role of intelligence and technology working in concert, and the overwhelming, war-winning power of sustainable, industrial-scale production. These are the real, hard-won truths of the conflict. The myths, in all their romantic glory, are an obstacle to this understanding. They are a siren song, luring us away from the difficult, complex, and vital lessons of the past. And that is why, for the sake of history itself, they must be confronted, dismantled, and, ultimately, defeated.